Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, especially to the panelists and to all of you in the audience. My name's Nick Thorpe. I'm a writer, BBC journalist and filmmaker, and I've spent more than half my life in this city. And it's very nice to be back in the Central European University in this rather underused building. Our title this afternoon, Towards Polycentric Governance, Building Room for Democratic Experimentalism in the Political, Urban and Corporate World. It's quite a mouthful, but if you think about it, there's a lot to talk about there. One of the panelists, if you saw earlier versions of the panel, a government representative, first of all Gergely Gulyás and later Balázs Orbán, would have been with us on the panel. Balázs Orbán sent his apologies saying the time pressures made it impossible for him to attend. It will be a different dynamic, of course, without a member of the government here, but we'll manage somehow, I think, without him. I've also been told we have to stick very closely to the time frame, and as well as the four panelists you see before you, we have two more panelists who I hope will be with us, and I can see them there. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and then we'll get into the discussion. And I hope there'll be some time at the end. We have tried to keep some time at the end for questions from the floor and also for summing up comments from Larry Diamond from the University of Stanford, who will also be joining us online just to sum up the discussion. Introducing the panelists. LaTosha Brown, on my right, is originally from Selma, Alabama. She's an American community organizer, political strategist and consultant. She's also co-founder in 2016 of Black Voters Matter, the Black Voters Matter Fund, an organization which successfully mobilized the black vote in several key elections. She's also an accomplished jazz singer. Peter Kurz, who's joining us online? Yes, Peter Kurz, Social Democratic Mayor of the important city of Mainz in southwest Germany, with a population of 300,000. In a recent TED talk, Mr. Kurz said the following: "We have one advantage. Cities are much more inclusive than nation states because it is much easier to harness identity on a local basis and to create a sense of belonging on a local basis than on a nation-state level." So very close then to the central theme of the Budapest Forum. Cristina Corduneanu-Huci, originally from Romania, is a political economist from the Central European University. Our host today, one of our hosts today, Cristina works on economic development and government transparency in different political regimes, including Morocco, Turkey and Romania. Gábor Kerpel-Fronius, Deputy Mayor of the City of Budapest since October 2019. He comes from the Momentum political movement and first caught the public eye by pointing out the need to speak to those he called the orphans of Fidesz. Like LaTosha then, looking for ways to include sections of the population which the usual political formations are failing to reach. Charles Sabel is Professor of Law and Social Science at Columbia Law School. His research focuses on public innovations, European Union governance, labour standards and ultra-robust networks. In his work, he's developed the theory of democratic experimentalism, which I suspect has something to do with the title of our panel today. He's also speaks in his work about the theory of continuous mutual disruption, which I hope we'll also have time to talk about today in the limited time available to us. Last but not by no means least, Tim Dixon, joining us online. Tim is the founder of More in Common, which works to reduce polarization and to develop communication strategies that can unite people across the lines of division and strengthen people's sense of belonging and identity. I found a quotation actually from one of Tim's colleagues, from Luke Trill. More in Commons research has found that the issues that motivate less engaged voters are very different from what inflames the base on both the left and right. So lots to talk about and not very much time. Perhaps to launch our discussion, I'd like to turn to each of you to explain briefly in turn what you feel the title of this panel, Democratic Experimentalism, Polycentric Governance, means, and relate it to your own work. And if I may, Charles, Chuck, if I could start with you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Let me just start with an immediate anecdote. When I came into the room, I encountered Nick and I asked him, what panel is this? And he said it was about democratic experimentalism. And I said, what's that about? And he said, well, it's really boring. You don't want to know about that. But there are all these interesting people on the panel. And he mentioned all of you. And he went on and gave, I mean, quite informed and appreciative accounts. And then I introduced myself. And he tried to recover in a gracious way because he's a nice fellow. But the gist of it is he thinks you should hear from all of you, and I'm happy to agree. I'm experiencing something I haven't in a year and a half called jet lag. So I'm happy to vanish. And the connection. If it comes back to it, I'll say something about my work. I'm not shy about that. But having just had the priceless experience of learning what somebody really thinks should be going on, I'm not going to interrupt it.
Yeah, actually, LaTosha next maybe, and then yeah, we'll go around the back. Sorry.
So I'm really happy to be here. So thank you for having me in this discussion. You know, I think we have to really center, when I looked at the title, you know, I think about the work that I do and a lot of the pro-democracy work that I do. You know, there's kind of this discussion, you're doing all this for democracy, and I'm saying, no, I'm not. I'm actually doing this for humanity. That for me, the way that I see the work around building democracy, you know, I think that there's a fundamental piece around, as we're talking about how are we experimenting. I mean, part of it is, it's the human experiment. How do we share power? How do we share space? How do we engage in a governance, which each and every person has a sense of agency and able to use that sense of agency. And so in America, which is a big experiment, and even when I think about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you know, while a democracy has been laid out, I think, very beautifully and clearly, it has not been achieved. And so in many ways, it is still very experimental because there is a fundamental question of can we as a humanity share power in such a way that we're actually, instead of people disappearing, I think there's this kind of idea around democracy being this unified one thought, right? That in order for us to have that pluralism, you can't have democracy without having pluralism, right? But there's this constant tension around, there has to be this one central thought, a central way of being, that in itself is going to lend itself to democracy. And we're seeing the evidence all around the world, including in my own nation, around why that is not the case. And so for me, when I think about polycentric, I think about circles, because essentially, you know, there's different circles and different circles of influence, from corporations to communities to government to NGOs. You know, I think, though, fundamentally, we get caught up in the process around what democracy is and not necessarily around what democracy is supposed to be for. It is supposed to be for people having the opportunity to engage. There is no way that you're going to have, it is in our human nature to want to participate in a process of governing something that governs us. It is just human nature. Even a child, at some point, I don't know if any of you all, as a 2 or 3 year old, will assert their authority at some point around, no, I want to pick my own clothes, I want to put my own shoes on. It is part of human nature for us to want to assert and affirm our power and our agency. And so if we're not creating governments, or we're not creating systems that allow itself where people can actually freely participate and be able to use their agency, what we're going to see is we're going to constantly see conflict. It is again, democracy is actually lending itself to what I think is very natural for what people want. People want to participate in a process of where they are self-governed, or they have an influence over what governs them.
Maybe Gábor and then Cristina, and then we'll bring in.
I think I come from a little bit different experience than LaTosha actually lined out. I think in Hungary we have a tendency for paternalistic government, which is to a great extent increased by this illiberal government that we are having in the past 11 years. And I think this complements this worldwide disillusionment in professional politics, which is distancing people, distancing societies from actual professional politics. And when we came into office in 2019, I think our political instinct and the political statement that we wanted to make and still want to make point in the same direction. That we have to show a new political culture which is very much opposed to this illiberal and paternalistic tendency that we are experiencing in Hungary. We have to demonstrate what because there's also an ongoing debate for 150 or 200 years about centralization and municipality government, etc. So we have to make a statement about what we think about municipality governance, self-governance, and also to make a statement about inclusion of the people. And for that reason, coming back to this term of experimentalism, we are trying to make use of solutions that people in other cities, other countries are experimenting with, like civic councils, participatory budgeting, and all these things that are quite new developments in politics, even elsewhere, and to try to find out how people in Hungary, in Budapest, in a very different cultural and educational environment react to these, to what extent these things are usable at all in our society, in our particular political system, and to try to adapt them through our failures or not complete successes. And I think that is what I find most challenging in this experimentalism, which I stand for very much, and even the right to fail in certain experiments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, organizers, for this wonderful event. This is an experiment in itself, I believe, because it brings a lot of people together from various walks of life, interested in policy and politics. I believe the fault for the title might be placed with academics like myself. We are highly tolerant of jargon, let's put it this way. But polycentric governance has a very respectable historical legacy and trajectory, of course, that we should attribute it to the late Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner in economics, in fact the first woman, the first female to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics. And I think that when she came up with polycentric, with the idea of polycentrism, she thought of circles. I completely agree with LaTosha. And she was writing at a time when the two big solutions out there for the production of public goods were the state or the market, state, corporation. And she started to focus on the micro level and to see how people in situations of crisis, when natural resources are depleting, when there is deforestation, when the water is running out, where the quality is diminishing, how ordinary people, in collaboration with the state and with companies from the market, can solve problems extremely creatively. And I think that polycentrism, at least in my mind, and in the original conceptualization, means exactly that. A tolerance for complexity and chaos, for many different circles that sometimes overlap, sometimes collaborate, sometimes compete, but work together for solving a particular very tangible micro problem. And what I take, and this is a little bit meta-philosophical if you wish, because I think it gets out of the policy area, a little bit in the spirit of LaTosha, it's humanity. My lesson from Ostrom's idea of polycentrism, it's also a fundamental belief in the individual ability, in the ability of the human individual to actually solve problems in a group, collectively. We know from a lot of laboratory experiments, from a lot of social science studies, that individuals are not very good at solving problems by themselves in a laboratory, even basic mathematical problems. But they are extremely good when they engage in persuasion, in deliberation, in communication. And I think that the idea of polycentrism is that city governments, national governments, federal governments should harness the fantastic ability of innovation, of creativity that resides with the individual. I think I'll stop here for now, but I'm happy to continue later.
Thank you very much. Peter Kurz, in Mannheim, your thoughts on the title and how that relates to your work running a big city, which would be, I guess in Hungarian terms, it would be if Mannheim was in Hungary, it would be the second biggest city.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this dynamic conversation. I would like to share some reflections on the title as a European mayor, and I underline European, and I want to start with that. I think the concept of polycentric governance may be decades old, but our discussion could not be more relevant today. And the setting is, of course, in the Pact of Free Cities. And so the Pact of Free Cities was first developed as a reaction to rising nationalism, which opposes both the European idea and the notion of decentralized power and local self-government. And we all experience that complex problems require complex solutions, not one size fits all policy set by national governments. It is in these moments of crisis that we see a real need for democratic experimentalism, and we have a kind of during the pandemic on the local level. So we all tried to figure out how's the best way to deal with different aspects, and of course this was a kind of experimentalism on the local level. And we need on this level the latitude to find solutions that fit our communities. Polycentric governance is not just a pipe dream. If we look to Brussels, we can see clearly that it is central to the EU's structure. The EU divides governance responsibilities between the Commission, Parliament, and Council, but beyond this, the EU establishes the Committee of the Regions, which represents local and regional governments across Europe, and it's consulted on all laws that impact cities and regions. The European Union is important for local government in another central way. Europeanization and decentralization benefit us at the local level. The European multi-level system is an interconnected political bargaining system. The levels of action and decision-making are arranged non-hierarchically. Instead, political decisions are the result of negotiations involving state and non-state actors. Since supranational EU institutions such as the European Commission depend on the local level to implement their policies, Europeanization and decentralization, vice versa, lead to a strengthening of the local level. Local and supranational levels thus form an independent community of interests. Cooperations between the European Union and local governments makes us more effective in our efforts to address complex challenges at all levels of government. To this end, Mannheim is one of the first cities in Europe to localize the European Green Deal by developing our own local Green Deal. But our local Green Deal is not simply the implementation of European policies. It identifies existing gaps and brings together ideas, projects, and stakeholders from across our city. We set up different so-called strategy groups to define projects and prepare sectoral deals. But above all, the process is an open offer to everyone, from civil society and private citizens to the private sector and academia, to create a sustainable Mannheim together. So that's the inclusive approach, which is already mentioned. On the global level, polycentric governance means establishing local self-government in all countries and involving the local level not only in implementing, but also in defining policies. I'm the chair of the Global Parliament of Mayors, a governance body of, for, and by mayors, and we see ourselves as a political movement to turn this vision into a reality. So there are many similarities to the Pact of Free Cities, and I was happy to offer my support to the pact, which was signed today, not just because I believe in the democratic principles that it espouses, but also because I think this brings us one step closer toward building a world in which local governments are accepted as equal partners. Local government is the level of government closest to the people, experienced in deliberations involving many stakeholders and building bridges. So cities and their leaders must be involved in global, European, and national conversations on critical issues and work hand in hand with the other levels to take on global challenges. So thank you. These were just first reflections on the title of our debate.
Thank you very much, Peter. And last but not least, Tim Dixon. I'm sorry to leave you to last, but I guess the title of your organization, More in Common, suggests that there is already something in common. And I think in such a polarized world, many of us would feel often that there, the different political camps, the different political tribes really have nothing in common, but you've clearly found something in common in order to have more in common.
Thank you, Nick, and it's great to join the panel. I thought that LaTosha started us off well, not just now, but this morning when, because of the time lags on our Twitter timelines, my image was that she was starting the day on a plane across the Atlantic with a mimosa in hand, which I thought is probably a good way for any panel discussion like this to start. I think the point of this conversation is to look for the things that we're not doing that we need to do to strengthen democracy, to build healthier democracies. The reflection, we've just done a big study of sort of state of democracy, attitudes towards democracy across 5 countries, US and 4 European countries. And the thing that jumps out from that is just the distance for a large proportion of the population that's quite disengaged from politics, but very distrustful of their elites. And I think the task that democracy isn't just something that past generations created for us. A democracy must constantly reproduce its legitimacy to its people through good results, through proving to citizens its effectiveness and its superiority to other systems. And that starts with understanding the values and identities of people and forging common ground.
Thank you.
While you're musing, do you mind if I?
Please do. Delighted.
So let me just concur with a lot of this, but add some background. First, experimentalism comes from John Dewey, the great American philosopher of democracy. That doesn't mean it's a good idea, but it's useful to remind us that the idea of democracy as a continually evolving, unnecessarily collective response to collective problems is not something from today. Despite the idea of a constitution and a constitutional moment, democracy has to always be reimagined and reinstitutionalized. So that's a fundamental, all the more urgent for today. And so coming here, I prepared myself by looking again at two books, and they suggest a danger but also a possibility. So One of the books is called The Light That Failed, which many of you will know. It's by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. It's a terrific book that explains the upsurge of conservative thought as a response to the way in which liberal thought was introduced into Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And it was introduced as you are now taken from slavery, and you will be able to enjoy the benefits of freedom, provided that you become exactly like us and forswear, take a distance from all that you were corruptly in the past. And that idea that you would be redeemed if only you would become like the superior other was doubly wrong. It was deeply degrading in itself, and the model that was being proposed failed even in its home territory. I don't know whether that book is a fair description of what went on in Hungary or the rest of Eastern Europe. It describes a lot of what has gone on in the United States. It is a very good description of what has gone on in the United States. And that brings me to the danger, because as absolutely necessary as it is, indispensable, that the local level take a more and more prominent role, not just in green things, but in the renewal of democracy, so too it is important that that increasing role not be understood as a repetition of the idea that if you come and join us, come to the city, be like the people in the city, embrace the things that we embrace, then you will be saved. You get a second chance if you associate not with liberalism, but with the liberal cities in your country. Now, I deeply respect this idea of reaching out in a city like Budapest, because as the mayor of Warsaw said in a terrific talk earlier today, unless you can win over the rural population and the conservative remnant in the cities, there is no chance of national power. So even if you were not true convinced Democrats, you would be foolish politicians if you didn't try to do this. But and here's the acute form of the danger. And it's understandable, but it's tricky, and it points to its defects point to an alternative. The tricky part is the idea that there is a form of deliberation, a citizen jury, a deliberative poll, a citizen assembly, some form in which people are randomly collected or brought together, informed by experts, and then deliberate. So they're taken out of their normal context, redeemed from the bad things that make them susceptible to authoritarianism, and then in this protected space they come to a decision, and the decision, and I have heard, going from panel to panel, I've heard 7 versions of that, all carried forward with deep understanding of the local context, but the idea is, it's let me just say softly, it's tricky. It can slide into a version of you're corrupt, but you could come join the citizen panel, join the deliberative jury. So I don't think that these things inevitably fail. Larry Dime may have something to say about it. It's not the idea of deliberation that's wrong. People can learn to deliberate. They're not as corrupt as this view might make you think. But the idea of constructing, renewing democracy by constructing a parallel democracy alongside, that's not a good idea. And it is to have the light that failed fail again. So one last point. I heard in conversations and in several of the presentations that, and here just limiting myself only to the green part of this, though there's a component that would be the same for education, would be the same for the delivery of many other public goods. One thing that has become clear during the pandemic is that the use of public space, especially under green pressure, has brought to light not just the failure of authoritarianism, but the failure of traditional urban city planning mechanisms to take account of the needs of people. So the idea of a park used to be a big giant thing. Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a socialist and a savage opponent of slavery, everybody come together in one place to appreciate beauty. That idea of the park is gone. The park is a mini space. It helps with the runoff of pollution. It helps with shopkeepers. It helps with a million things. The mechanisms for bringing communities into the definition, operation, financing of those spaces is new for democracy. It's not the deliberative form of this. It's something, a fusion of the old and the new. My hunch is, in this Deweyan sense of the continuing renewal of democracy, that it's those kinds of experiments will be the ones that lead to the renewal we all hope for.
There's one thing that I just want to weigh in on. I agree totally. Yeah, I think we spend as we should. There's the principle and there's the process as we're talking about democracy. Where I think the missed opportunity is in the value, that actually valuing a democratic process, that we speak as if government is going to include the people. You know, isn't that like an oxymoron? Like, isn't it particularly? And I'll say that from the perspective of where I come from in the U.S., where it actually says government is of the people, for the people, and by the people, right? But now we're fighting currently right now where elected officials are deciding who are going to be the voters, you know. And so I'm raising this because I think there's a values conversation that we never get to because we're often talking about the process and the principles of democracy. And let me just say, coming from a nation that we've actually killed people in the name of democracy, right, and declared war. It seems like it's a separate piece, but it's not, because I think that fundamentally, thinking about democracy from a values frame, right? I wonder how, when we're constructing governments, right, that would look very differently to me, which is why I'm constantly I'm raising the issue around humanity, centering humanity in the process. That government instead, let government in many ways, forms of government have been weaponized and used by the elite to determine where resources and to organize societies. That's across the world. And so what if there was a value of which I often say around the love of humanity, which may seem Pollyannish to many, right? But fundamentally that we're creating and constructing societies, because even though Dewey raises as an academic term, indigenous cultures have been practicing democracy since antiquity, right? I can go from Mali, where I've spent a significant amount of time around how they form their decision-making process, how their governance, how their sharing of resources. I can go from other indigenous cultures. My point is, there is something that I think is getting missing when we're separating the paradigm of thinking of governance as how we're going to govern people, without really centering that the whole point of this is supposed to be around the advancement of humanity, around people being centered. And so what people are frustrated with is because, quite frankly, we're seeing that across the board. We're seeing where government has been used as a tool to protect the interests of the elite across the board, right? And we're seeing that even the governance of people, you know, it comes out of that space. And so I believe that there's an appetite. I think that there's a reframing. I actually think there's a paradigm shift. You know, even in the US, you know, fundamentally, most of the time when we looked at elections, and I'll use our last 2020 election, when we worked around elections in the US, this was political parties, which still are the core two parties that have a significant amount of impact and influence on setting the political landscape. But there's a third rail that is developing, a third rail of organizations like my own and other organizations that are literally creating corporate accountability campaigns, that are literally determining elections on the party piece. I can go on either side. We can go from the Tea Party to I can go across the spectrum. My point is, the obvious is being missing. The obvious, what I think is being exploited, is that people's frustration is actually centered in a real narrative. There is something really fundamentally wrong where people feel like they're left out of the process. And so how we think about governance going forward, how we think about a democracy and creating democratic processes, we have to shift that frame to fit where people are right now. And I think that that's where the tension is.
Gábor, how are you doing that in Budapest? How are you including people that are left out of the process? Perhaps people that didn't vote for you. And I'm going to put the same question to Peter Kurz in a moment.
Well, we are trying to get to people, and this is something that in which we have to change very much in Budapest, because I think that even our city administration, our governance structure, our administration, our institutions are very rigid. They are not open, so there is no service-oriented functionality, not even client-oriented functionality. So even if in the everyday life, I think everything that represents the city administration is very rigid, and the very thick walls of the city hall are actually very symbolic or metaphorical or whatever. So the main idea is to try to transform everything that we have in our outer communications. So not only try to approach people with push messages, but to ask questions. The idea of participatory budgeting was actually trying to shift the attention of people to local developments which they find useful in their own environment, which would not be as significant as to even catch the attention of anybody on the political level or in the city administration level. And I also have the thought or the hope in participatory budgeting that it is going to be an opportunity to bring people together, caring for their local environment would actually bring people together in a very divided society. And very divided society not only in the social or the cultural manner of speaking, but also on a very, very inexplicable level of party political divisions. So I think the idea is to get people who are very antagonistic on this party political level to start getting to talk about local issues and to experience the ability to solve things together, be that a little playing ground for their children or whatever. And I think so to actually create an environment where people can experience that the government, the city government is responsive to their needs. And of course, there is this other matter that in Hungary, any NGOs or civil organizations that are not loyal to the central government have been put through quite some molestation in the past few years. And I think Budapest did not really care for these NGOs, which actually represent quite a lot of experience, of traditions, and also a method of involving people. And what we are trying to do is set up an institutional discourse with these NGOs who have been neglected, and to try to forge cooperations with them to try to reach people who the city government would not be able to reach. And it is not the people we are unable to reach are not the people that it is usually very difficult to reach, so in social deprivation or cultural deprivation. But I think we are, as a city governance, have quite a backlog in actually reaching ordinary citizens. So they're not very many people involved in city politics at all. And I think that has to be worked on very much.
We're running out of time a little bit. We've got 12 minutes left of this part of the panel before I open to the floor. Peter Kurz, in Mannheim, I notice from a recent interview with you that you speak a lot about acting on a local level on climate change issues. So green issues, reducing CO2 emissions, businesses, households, industry, CO2 from traffic. Briefly, how have you done that? How have you included the citizens, and again, people that perhaps didn't vote for you, in that process?
I've been mayor for 14 years now, and the amount of participation processes raised at least doubled or more, and the range of participation processes, how we do it, the methodology is really broad. So we have randomized groups, we have co-creation processes with young people, with neighborhoods, of course, and so on. So we have a list of all our projects, which is transparent to the public. And on the list, it's defined which way of participation we will have. So this changed a lot. And what you asked for, we started with a really big mission statement process with 2,500 people participating during this process to define a mission statement, Mannheim 2030. And now on our local Green Deal, as I mentioned, we formed strategy groups with stakeholders from the civil society on different issues. But what I want to underline is, I think this is important, of course, otherwise we wouldn't do it. And it's, in a way, maybe the future of democracy in not only the cities, but this is not sufficient to fight populism and to avoid polarization in our society. And if you look into Europe, you have totally different political cultures regarding participation, co-creation, and so on, and experimentalism. And we have the northern countries, we have Switzerland, UK, which is unfortunately not a part of Europe anymore, but has a totally different political style, more mandate-driven. But in each of these countries, you had rising populism. You have the feeling of people excluded. So there is no proof for me that this is really a sufficient tool. If you look to Germany, I think Germany is a bit special because right now we contain it in a way. And I think the basic factor is the narrative. We have a strong narrative based on our history. Without this narrative, and we try to create kind of narratives on the local level, we wouldn't be able to contain in such a manner the populistic movement. So I think we have two dimensions here. One is, of course, how to involve people, and this is very helpful, especially to secure the quality of our decisions. You mentioned the public space. And the kind of planning of the past. So to have another quality, this is very helpful to involve people. And on the long run, of course, it builds trust in a way, but it's not sufficient to answer the question with which you started, or in a way that we have the polarization of society and that we have nationalistic movements and populistic movements.
Thank you for mentioning the narrative there, because in the short time we've got left, I'd like to ask first Tim and then Cristina to talk about, because we've been talking about the practice of everyday politics and how to include more people, but it's also, of course, very important, and I say this as a journalist, how to tell that story and how to explain what we're doing what's going on in terms that people can understand, the sort of the storytelling. So first Tim and then Cristina, if you could talk about your experience of how to put that message across, or how to explain in such a way that people do feel included.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with listening to people who don't feel heard and who feel deeply disrespected by elites, which is 40 to 50% of the population in most of our democracies. I think another part is very consciously building a shared sense of identity. It's very powerful. If people feel a sense of belonging and connection to each other, you can break them away from that us versus them kind of polarization. You can actually, it is possible to transcend some of the divisions. So an example, we've been doing some work in smaller German cities and towns, and a town called Freital, which is in Saxony, very divided by the arrival of new migrants in the last few years. And the work that we found, that the breakthrough that we were able to achieve, the partnership was able to achieve there, was when, instead of focusing on the refugees, the migrants, who were very much the other for a lot of the established residents, the whole focus shifted to strengthening the Freital's identity as a sort of civic community, a local community, and a story of inclusion within that the recently arrived, the newcomers, were part of that community just as the long-established newcomers, and just little things like creating a community calendar shared all across the town of 40,000 people that represented visually these newcomers as being alongside the longer-term residents. That produced breakthrough and brought a lot more groups, some of the more conservative groups, who didn't want the language of diversity and so on, who weren't politically there, but they were behind that shared identity piece. And I think you can get a breakthrough there. And I think it's something that's really needed. It's also being proved, if you think of Ankara, Istanbul, Budapest, Slovakia, all examples that different panelists have talked about today in different panels, where there's been that deliberate coming together of unlikely allies, forming the single ticket and managing to have some success in very hostile environments where the liberalism and authoritarian us versus them story has been winning. So that piece of giving people the confidence that unlikely allies can come together is also really important to building that narrative. And we do a lot of work around the psychology and values that sits behind that. Who are the people you most need to speak to, and how do you build a story that unites people? But I mean, the positive news is to say it is possible, and we are seeing some examples where that happens. But the dynamics that we operate in, particularly a social media-driven sort of us versus them, always elevating the loudest and most polarizing voices, it really makes it tough.
Thank you very much, Cristina.
Yes, I completely agree with what has been said before. I would add that based on the studies that we have of participatory governance, participatory budgeting, there is bad news, good news, yeah? So bad news, Porto Alegre. This is the first large experiment in participatory governance. Most of you are probably familiar with it. It started in the late 80s with the famous left-wing party in Brazil organizing the base. It achieved spectacular results. Essentially in 10 years, the number of schools quadrupled. Sewage, water were attained 100% coverage in a city that was marked by profound inequalities between rich and poor. There was a lot of excitement in participation. After 2004, the excitement goes down. There is another party in power that essentially shuts down or co-opt previous activists. So in that sense, the good news is the good things happen, yeah? If there is excitement about very concrete, tangible issues, people's water connection, people's sewage connection, neighborhood identity, then participation deliberation works. The bad news is that it's not completely independent of politics. If we want to believe that it's independent of politics, that we can take it, transplant it, put some people in the room, across the ideological spectrum, and it works. We know it doesn't. And this is not my reason for skepticism, but my reason for an invitation to rethink the way in which we do participation, because it has to sound real to participants. People who attend need to have a feeling that their voice is heard, and the decision on the particular policy area basically takes them into account. And I feel that that part is missing. And we don't know, even as social scientists, we actually don't know what works. We know that tangibility works, but we don't know what features of the process works. Randomization, maybe. Variety, diversity in ideological preferences, maybe. But we don't have very concrete results in terms of what gives the best outcomes. So rather than ending this, from my side, on a pessimistic social scientist sort of boring note, nothing works, I'd rather think that we should invest in understanding, first of all, what forms of participation are fruitful for an engagement with policymakers in general.
Thank you very much. We have, yep,
Just to avoid agreeing completely that it would be terrible to end on an academic social science note, let me just underscore two really important things that the mayors, vice mayors and mayors said. So one, Gábor's extremely open, brief, but a very open discussion about the thickness of the walls. I think that's a general experience, though few people are as direct about it as even the places that are engaged in participatory experiments are not, it's a very thin thing. The second thing related to that you said, which I thought was extremely important, is that the process, you can describe this as participatory this or participatory that, but that's in a sense not a pretext, but it's a cover, a beginning of a deeper process of experimentation, of learning what really will work. And that is a sub-theme of this entire conference. I wish it had been the theme. And next time, but I really do, because it's what you're discovering under the guise of doing something that is academically respectable or in the spirit of the new democracy. It's what you're discovering that is not in accord with that, which points to the future. First point. Second point, the mayor of Mainz, I think, said something which should be the beginning and end of this discussion, which is that it is really true that all the forms of participation throughout Europe and certainly in the United States have not been adequate to stop the rise of populism. Now, why is that? One part of it is the forms are probably deficient. But there's a related issue, maybe inextricably connected. All of this goes together with the end of, as several people have said, of the left-right party systems. We had a world that was built to address, with political differences, a range of problems which are not the problems of the people who are left out now. And unless somebody finds a way to offer a realistic prospect of social security, of continuing social security to the young people who in the countryside, in the city, whether they're migrants or not, irrelevant, unless there is a way to give them, the kind of education and security that gives them an assured place in society, it doesn't matter what forms of participation will be offered, unless they're forms of participation that help articulate those substantive solutions.
We've got time for just a couple of questions from the floor. Please do ask, take part, something there. Yeah, thank you. This microphone.
Thanks very much. Martin Sandby from the Financial Times. It's fascinating, but I'd like to challenge all the panelists, I think, a bit. So I take the whole reason why we're having this discussion is the idea that polycentrism or polycentric governance could provide a remedy for the dysfunction we see in liberal democracy as we know it. But the reason for that dysfunction is of course, a breakdown in trust. We heard it in Mayor Caraccioni's speech this morning. It's that you have such deep divisions between different social groups that liberal democracy can no longer generate legitimate, accepted, generally accepted collective decision-making. But that is a problem for any form of polycentrism as well, I would think, because having different centers of power also relies on some acceptance by all those centers that there are many centers of power. Polycentrism itself has to be accepted by these different groups. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is each, or at least one of the different centers or sources of power muscling out the other ones and ultimately trying to take over and increase their power at the cost of others. And we can see this between national governments and cities. We can see it between social groups. Think about how Black Lives Matter has been used to create fear in some populations in the US, for example, in order to push back. So it seems to me that if the problem we're trying to resolve is a breakdown in trust and deep divisions between social groups, that is as much a problem for any sort of polycentric model as it is to more classical models. That's the challenge I want to put to the panelists. If that's the problem we're solving, isn't that as much a problem for polycentrism?
Thank you very much. Let's take another question here quickly, and then we'll have a very quick answers. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ralf Leonhard of Tageszeitung Taz in Berlin. This forum is about sustainable democracy. Cristina, you mentioned the example of Porto Alegre, which shows that sometimes democracy is not sustainable. Another feature of democracy is the alternability of power. So how do you explain that if just another party gets into power, democracy crumbles?
Would anyone like to respond to the first question?
But if somebody else. So
just briefly.
Very briefly. So cryptically briefly, because I've spent a lot of a working lifetime, according to Nick, a boring and wasted working lifetime, trying to figure out how trust can be generated endogenously among strangers, between strangers. That's the question that you're posing, which is that polycentricity assumes people who are not in accord or are independent of each other. They have to trust each other in order to get to a cooperative solution. How can they do that? Precisely because mistrust is the precondition. And the answer is that's what innovation is about today in general, because you're innovating with people that you did not know before. So you're innovating with strangers, and there is a whole set of new institutions in the economy and in experimental parts of the public administration which build mechanisms by which you can do exactly what it is that your good question supposes can't be done. And I promise if you're interested, I'll tell you.
LaTosha, yeah.
Just two quick pieces. So one, just to build off that, one, let me start with, there's an assumption that there's a breakdown, right? Democracy as it has been envisioned has left out a whole lot of people. And so instead of looking at a breakdown, perhaps it's a breakthrough. Perhaps we're being forced to evolve how we think about the sharing of power and governance. And I don't know if we're considering that, because on some level, when we're talking about democracy, in my own country, that has a beautiful document, I and my ancestors were unable to participate in the governance for more than 200 years. And so this whole notion that now the country is so divided, no, the country completely ignored millions of people under this guise that everything was fine. And so I'm saying that at this moment, perhaps what we're seeing as a breakdown is providing an opportunity of a breakthrough for us to look at things a little bit differently. The second thing is, I'll go back to it, I'll keep saying it over and over again. This is not just about how, we can't process our way out of this. This is a values conversation around humanity. When we're talking about the sharing of power, as long as you've got groups of people that believe that they are entitled to power greater than others, we will have this tension. It may shift forms, it may change parties, it may create another name, but there is a fundamental question as a humanity that we're all going to have to answer. And that is, one, do we believe that each and every one of us has the right to be able to be a part of the process that governs us? And until we're actually we make this assumption that that's a value that we all have, although historically it's shown that it has not been. And so that is the tension. To me, the tension isn't just the process, it is the values that has been creating and shaping the paradigm in the process.
Thank you. The second question, I think, was largely directed to Cristina. Well, to everybody. But I'm afraid we don't have time for everyone to answer it. But if Cristina would like to take that one.
That's a very good question, but I think it points again to the two worlds that we're talking about, representative democracy, right, and participatory democracy. And for some, that's a contradiction. In a sense, what you're talking about, parties succeeding in power, we're talking about a robust, let's say, representative democracy, yeah? The hope in Porto Alegre was that the participatory democracy that had tangible positive outcomes would have been institutionalized enough over the last 20 years to actually survive the transition in power of political parties. And it seemed that it didn't. So in that sense, I think that the answer to your question is yes, the alternation in power points to a vibrant, let's call it a vibrant democracy in the case of politics in Porto Alegre, but not to a vibrant polycentric system of governance. So I would leave it like that, right? Because nobody would argue, nobody who's familiar with Porto Alegre would argue that the policy world of the city is better without participatory democracy. So I think it's robust representative democracy, but it's suboptimal polycentric governance, to go back to our rather complicated title.
With that, I'm afraid, looking at the clock, we could talk about this a lot. I'd like to thank all the panelists very much for your comments, and thank you for being here. And we'll turn now to Larry Diamond, who I hope is with us for his commentary, his summary of what we've had in this panel. Is Larry with us there?
Yes, he is. Thank you very much, Nick, for your really able and graceful and stimulating moderation of this fascinating panel. I have learned so much by listening to it. So I realize we only have a few minutes. I'm going to speak fast and release you to the break. First of all, I wanted to comment on what Cristina just said about the kind of waning or decay of the Porto Alegre model, and link it back to what one of the panelists said earlier. It might have been Tim, but it's or Charles. It's a major theme that I think runs through the time we're living in, and not just the panel. And that is, I think the experience of the last decade or so, with the rise of challengers to democracy and to liberal democracy in countries that we thought were consolidated liberal democracies. And of course, that's what we thought about Hungary. But it's also what we thought about the United States, frankly. That assumption that things will just go on, that once something is institutionalized or has developed a kind of maturity, that it's just going to continue on its own, that kind of linear and teleological thinking, I think, has really died in the last 10 years. And maybe the whole stream of theorizing around the process of democratic consolidation has died, or at least been partially derailed as well. And what we're left with is, frankly, a lot of the themes of this panel, that democracy will not automatically survive just because it has, that it's in need of constant re-engagement with people who are going to feel alienated or frustrated with the social and economic challenges of the time they're living in. This is not the first era. I hardly need to say this in the center of Europe. This is not the first era in which people have felt disconnected from their representative processes and have responded to the siren song of authoritarianism. And of course, back in the 20s and 30s, it was a much more blatant form than in most of Europe now. And so we're left with the need to tend to our garden and constantly refurbish it and find new institutional forms, new ways of engaging. And I strongly endorse the link back to John Dewey and the need for constant experimentation, reinvention. So that's my first point. And if we're not thinking in linear terms, it's also important not to despair too much. The model of Porto Alegre and of participatory budgeting, first of all, is diffused to a lot of the rest of the world. So even if it is waned as a result of party alternation, in Porto Alegre, it has succeeded in diffusing to many other cities around the world. And it's inspired other elements, as we've heard reference to, of experimentation and popular involvement and new forms of participation. And second of all, it can be recovered, just as the crisis of democracy in Brazil can be repaired with party alternation again. So we don't want to despair in thinking that just because democracy is in crisis in Brazil or the United States, or because, in my opinion, democracy has been lost in Hungary or the Philippines or something, that is that these systems have slipped below the level of the minimum conditions of democracy, that democracy can't be recovered. So that's one thing. I think that Peter is right. We face an urgent challenge of illiberal populism that won't be addressed simply by promoting innovations and experimentation in the extension and deepening of democracy. We need something more to fight illiberal populism. And I would make here 4 points that we have to address, and people who believe in liberal values and deep democracy need to address the new or kind of evolving substantive policy challenges and issues and grievances that people are feeling. And this requires policy innovation and imagination, not just institutional innovation. Second, I think several people have spoken to this. We have to treat the targets and constituents of populism, including, but not only, in the rural and exurban areas, who are the obvious base of right-wing illiberal and authoritarian populism, with empathy and respect. That doesn't mean sympathy or agreement, but everybody wants dignity. I think this is a fundamental point that LaTosha was trying to make as well, that inclusion requires, first of all, respect for everyone's dignity, and everyone wants to be heard. And hearing them doesn't necessarily mean always agreeing with them, but it means not demeaning them. I see Tim nodding because I think that's been a core principle of the organization he founded and the work he's been doing. The third point I would make is that politics matters, that you really need broad coalitions that transcend some usual divisions to challenge illiberal populism and prevail. And here, I can't recommend enough, I'm constantly recommending it, the campaign of radical love of the Republican People's Party in Turkey, which has not defeated the AKP and its authoritarian project yet nationally, but we're talking about cities, so let's celebrate their success politically in Ankara and Istanbul and other cities in Turkey. Now, Erdogan is trying to undo that and rob them of power and so on. You're probably experiencing some of that authoritarian nibbling away at your authority in Budapest as well. But there is a model there, and I think your great mayor in Budapest understands that political logic and imperative. It's got to be, we have to transcend the polarizing rhetoric and logic of illiberal populists. You're not going to beat them at the game of polarization. This is something I keep saying to my Democratic friends with a capital D in the United States, and I think it's a lesson that so far has been only partially absorbed. Fourth, we need effective social media strategies to confront this polarization and to publicize the amazing work and innovation that we're doing at the local level and in small scale experiments like randomly selected participation in deliberative polling. There's been almost no discussion of social media here, but there is no hope of democratic repair and revival that doesn't think about how we can use social media more creatively and effectively for positive democratic ends, and how we can contain its toxic, polarizing dimensions. And finally, I would say that there's a need for democratic reform. And if you look at the United States and the war on voting rights that LaTosha is trying to defend against, and many of us as well, and now the war on simple things you take for granted in most European democracies, like just having neutral and professional administration of elections. We're facing the prospect of a breakdown of democracy in the United States in the next few years because of this war on truth, war on tolerance, war on inclusion, and war on just fundamental elements of democracy like electoral administration. So we have a massive amount of work to do to mobilize people at the local level, which we did, you saw effectively in California the other day, to fight against this subversion and to just stand up for basic principles of democracy that should be politically neutral principles. I want to close by saying that I think deliberative polling and deliberative democracy can be and must be used at the national level as well. We have an experiment going on right now, literally as we speak this week and next, where we have drawn together a random sample of the American public to deliberate on climate change and energy alternatives in advance of the Glasgow summit at the beginning of November. And, you know, we have a problem. We had so many people who wanted to participate in this deliberative poll that our sample is much larger than we were expecting. And since we're compensating them financially for their time, it actually is a problem, but it's the kind of problem you want in terms of democratic enthusiasm. And when you do a deliberative poll, you know, and it's only 600 people, you've got to disseminate the results of that to the wider public. And you need to use media for that, and social media and social networks and so on. And we hope to do another one on reform of our democratic institutions. And this will really be my final word, because the United States is a very antiquated democracy. And the mere fact that we can have the crisis we had over the presidential election process in 2020, or the mere fact that we can have partisan electoral officials, that is elected secretaries of state administering our elections at the subnational level, tells you how antiquated it is. So we have a huge agenda ahead of us, but I've taken a lot of ideas and inspiration from this discussion.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you very much, Gábor, Cristina, Chuck, and LaTosha, and of course online, Tim and Peter. And with that, we must close this session. Thank you very much to all of you.